The first thing my father said after the lawyer finished reading the preliminary will was, "Now you finally understand your place, Cassidy." I can still hear the sharp clink of his crystal glass against the mahogany table when he said it. I'm Cassidy Miller, 30 years old, and I spent the last decade earning my stripes as a viticulture expert, only to be treated like a stranger in my own home. We were standing in the grand hall of the Miller estate, a $12 million vineyard in the heart of Napa Valley, surrounded by the heavy scent of funeral lilies and the judgmental stares of our high society guests. My mother stood beside the marble fireplace, her arms folded tightly, wearing that cold, triumphant expression she used whenever she thought she had won. Then my brother Keaton leaned in with a smirk that made my skin crawl. "You should be grateful we're even letting you stay the night, you family failure," he whispered loud enough for the front row to hear. "Your fancy wine degrees are just expensive scrap paper that can't even buy you a meal." My father adjusted his silk tie, announcing to the room that he was now the sole trustee of the estate. "Now you're essentially a guest," he added casually, "and guests shouldn't overstay their welcome." I stood there in my black mourning dress, silent and steady, while my world was being carved up by the people who were supposed to protect me. I didn't argue. I couldn't. Not yet. But from the shadows near the library door, a silver-haired lawyer named Mr. Baxter watched me with a sharp, knowing gaze that suggested the real game hadn't even begun. The betrayal was just the beginning, but my grandmother had one last move they never saw coming. If you want to see how a family failure dismantles an empire of greed, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you don't miss the moment the tide finally turns. That night, sleep was a luxury I couldn't afford. I sat by the window of my childhood bedroom, the one my mother hadn't yet managed to clear of my existence, watching the moonlight silver the rolling hills of the vineyard. The air flowing through the screen was heavy, saturated with the intoxicating musky scent of ripening Cabernet grapes, a scent that had been the backdrop of my entire life. It was a fragrance that usually brought me peace, but tonight it felt like a silent witness to a coup. My father and Keaton were probably downstairs toasting to their new kingdom with a bottle of our reserve, oblivious to the fact that they were celebrating on a foundation they didn't understand. My mind drifted back to a sweltering July afternoon when I was barely 12 years old. The heat shimmered off the valley floor, and the dirt was so dry it cracked under my boots. Grandma Evelyn Miller had led me to the very edge of the estate where the oldest vines grew. She didn't look like a multimillionaire then. She looked like a woman of the earth, her hands stained with soil, and her face etched with the wisdom of 40 harvests. She knelt down, ignoring the dust on her linen trousers, and patted the rugged, sun-baked ground. "Look at the surface, Cassidy," she had said, her voice raspy but firm. "It looks dead, doesn't it? It's brittle and uninviting." She took my small hand in hers, pressing my fingers against the rough bark of an ancient vine. "People are just like these grapevines, those who only care about the surface, the prestige, the labels, the quick sugar. They wither the moment a summer drought hits. They have no depth. But the vines that struggle, the ones that push their roots deep through the limestone and the clay to find the hidden aquifers, those are the ones that survive the fire. They find the water that others don't even know exists." I remembered looking at her, confused by the intensity in her eyes. She wasn't just talking about agriculture. She was preparing me for the family I was born into. She knew even then that Franklin and Rosemary preferred the glamour of the tasting room to the grit of the vineyard. She saw Keaton's entitlement growing like a weed. Evelyn Miller was a woman who valued the invisible strength over the visible show. Years later, the memory of her final days in that sterile hospital room came rushing back with haunting clarity. She was frail, a shadow of the powerhouse who once managed hundreds of acres, but her grip on my hand was surprisingly strong. "Cassidy," she had whispered, the scent of lavender oil barely masking the smell of medicine. "They will try to tell you that you don't belong. They will try to redefine your value based on their own greed. But a day will come when you will finally understand why I structured my will the way I did. It wasn't an accident, and it wasn't a mistake. She stared directly into my soul, her gaze unwavering despite her exhaustion. Never doubt the value of your integrity even when it leaves you standing in the rain. The deep roots always find the water. Those words, which felt like a riddle back then, now echoed in the silence of my room. My mother's cold dismissal and my brother's taunts were just the surface drought. Grandma had spent years building a system that they were currently walking into blind and arrogant. I stayed awake until the first light of dawn began to touch the tops of the trellises, knowing that the failed daughter was the only one who truly knew the secrets buried in this soil. The following morning, the prestigious silence of the Miller estate was shattered not by the sounds of harvest, but by the frantic, sharp echoes of Keaton's voice. I was heading toward the kitchen when I saw him pacing the length of the sunroom, his face a sickly shade of gray that even the warm California sun couldn't mask. He was clutching his phone so hard his knuckles were white, screaming about margin calls and immediate liquidation. "I don't care about the risk," he barked into the receiver, his arrogance finally giving way to a desperate, wild-eyed panic. "Transfer the equity from the vineyard accounts now, or we're all dead in the water." Watching him, I realized the family pride he constantly bragged about was nothing more than a thin veil for his own incompetence. Keaton had always been a gambler, but I hadn't known the stakes were this high. My father, Franklin, walked into the room moments later looking aged and frayed around the edges. There was no mention of the vineyard's health or the welfare of our staff. They only spoke in the cold, hard language of debt and recovery. The atmosphere was thick with a tension so palpable, it felt like the air itself was curdling, a stark contrast to the dignified grace my grandmother had maintained for decades. I retreated to the study, hoping to find some semblance of order, but instead, I stumbled upon a stack of documents left carelessly on the desk. My eyes scanned the top page, a formal rejection letter from the bank regarding a massive bridge loan they had tried to secure against the estate. The reason for the denial was underlined in bold, incomplete legal clarity regarding future ownership rights. It was a slap in the face to their perceived authority. I realized then that Keaton hadn't just lost his own money. He had gambled away his soul on volatile crypto markets, and now he was trying to use the Miller heritage as his personal piggy bank. They weren't just managing the estate, they were looking for a way to butcher it before the creditors arrived. By noon, the betrayal took an even more destructive turn. I stood on the porch, my heart sinking, as I watched a commercial transport truck pull up to the aging cellar. My mother, Rosemary, was there holding a clipboard and directing workers to begin hauling out the premium oak barrels, the very ones containing the limited edition Cabernet that Grandma Evelyn Miller had started 10 years ago. These weren't just bottles of wine. They were the culmination of a decade of patient scientific precision and a deep respect for the land. They were the crown jewels of our cellar, meant to be aged for another 5 years to reach their true potential. "What are you doing, Mother?" I asked, my voice trembling with suppressed rage. "Those barrels aren't ready. Selling them now is a crime against the quality boss spent her life building." She didn't even look at me, her eyes fixed on the inventory list. "Quality doesn't pay the taxes, Cassidy." She snapped, her tone dripping with a cold, practical cruelty. "We found a buyer in Asia who is willing to pay cash upfront for the entire lot regardless of the age. We need the liquidity, and we need it today." I watched in agonizing silence as the workers rolled the barrels away, the heavy wood thudding against the metal ramp like a funeral drum. My father stood by, nodding in approval as he calculated the immediate influx of cash. They were liquidating history to pay for Keaton's mistakes, stripping the estate of its value just to keep their heads above water for another week. The empire they claimed to lead was rotting from the inside out, and for the first time I saw them for exactly what they were: parasites feasting on a legacy they had never truly earned. Determining that I couldn't let my grandmother's most personal legacy be auctioned off like common scrap, I waited until the shadows of the late afternoon stretched across the estate before making my move toward the private library. I knew that buried somewhere behind the oak panels of Evelyn Miller's sanctuary was her vineyard journal, a weathered leather-bound book containing generations of soil analysis and proprietary blending ratios that no corporate buyer could ever replicate. To my family, it was just an old notebook. To me, it was the heartbeat of the Miller estate. The air inside the library was cool and smelled of old parchment and dried lavender, a stark contrast to the chaotic greed vibrating through the rest of the house. After several minutes of frantic searching, my fingers finally brushed against the embossed leather hidden in a false bottom drawer of her desk. I clutched it to my chest, feeling a momentary surge of triumph. However, that feeling vanished as soon as I stepped back into the grand hallway. The double doors of the formal dining room were wide open, and the raucous sounds of clinking silverware and forced laughter spilled out into the corridor. I tried to slip past unnoticed, but a sharp, mocking voice brought me to a dead halt. "Well, look who's creeping around like a common thief," Keaton sneered, standing in the doorway with a half-empty bottle of our estate reserve in his hand. My parents, Franklin and Rosemary, were seated at the table with a man in a sharp gray suit, a real estate speculator whose presence here felt like a stain on the floorboards. Keaton stepped toward me, his eyes landing on the book tucked under my arm. "What do you have there?" Cassidy still trying to cling to the past. Before I could react, he reached out and snatched the journal from my grasp. I lunged forward to take it back, but he laughed, holding it high above his head while intentionally tipping his wine glass. A dark crimson stream of Cabernet poured directly over the leather cover and onto my dress. "You're a failure, little sister?" He hissed, his voice dripping with malice. "You're a glorified field hand who thinks she owns the place. But look at you, you're nothing." Rosemary didn't move to intervene. She simply sipped her water, her gaze cold and detached. My father, however, stood up slowly, his face reddening with a theatrical display of indignation. "This is the final straw, Cassidy." Franklin boomed, his voice carrying the practiced authority of a man who believed he was untouchable. "I am the trustee of this estate, and I will not have an agitator lurking in the shadows stealing property and disrupting our business dealings. You have no legal right to be in this house without my express invitation." He walked over to the front door and flung it wide open. Outside, a sudden violent spring storm had turned the sky into a bruised purple, and rain was lashing against the stone steps. "Since you've decided to act like a trespasser, you will be treated like one," he continued, pointing out into the darkness. "I am officially revoking your residency. I've already contacted the security firm. Your biometric access has been wiped from every lock on this property. You are no longer a Miller in my eyes. You are just an intruder." Keaton threw the wine-soaked journal onto the wet gravel outside, and before I could utter a single word of protest, Franklin gripped my shoulder and shoved me out into the downpour. The heavy mahogany door slammed shut with a finality that echoed in my bones, and I heard the heavy thud of the deadbolt sliding into place. I stood there drenched to the bone, staring at the blurred lights of the only home I had ever known. My fingertips were numb as I reached for the keypad on the gate, but the red light flashed, "Access denied." They hadn't just taken my inheritance, they had erased my existence from the land. I knelt in the mud to retrieve the ruined journal, the cold rain mixing with the bitter tears I refused to let them see. The flickering fluorescent light of the cheap motel on the outskirts of Napa hummed with a depressing rhythm, casting long, shaky shadows across the stained linoleum floor. I sat on the edge of the sagging bed, still shivering despite the thin wool blanket wrapped around my shoulders. On the bedside table lay the vineyard journal, its leather cover still damp and smelling of spilled Cabernet and rain. I carefully wiped the grime from its surface, my fingers trembling as I turned the fragile pages. That's when I saw it, tucked deep between the entries for the 1998 harvest, was an old yellowed business card. On the back, in Grandma Evelyn Miller's sharp, elegant cursive, were 6 words that felt like a lifeline thrown into a stormy sea. Call him when they close the doors. Underneath the message was the office number for Mr. Baxter. I didn't hesitate despite the fact that it was nearly midnight. The phone rang only twice before a calm, gravelly voice answered. "I've been sitting by this phone for 3 hours, Cassidy," he said, sounding neither surprised nor tired. I assumed Franklin wouldn't be able to contain his greed for much longer. "I take it you're no longer at the estate." I took a shaky breath, explaining the events of the evening, the real estate speculator, the wine barrels, and the final cold moment when the biometric locks were wiped. As I spoke, the silence on the other end was heavy, but it wasn't the silence of indifference. It was the silence of a predator waiting for the perfect moment to strike. "He thinks he won," I whispered, my voice cracking. "He thinks being the trustee gives him the right to erase me." Franklin always suffered from a fatal combination of arrogance and a lack of attention to detail. Mr. Baxter replied, and I could almost hear the thin smile in his voice. He read the first 3 pages of the will and assumed the rest was just legal boilerplate. He saw the title of trustee and thought it was a blank check. "But your grandmother was a woman who understood the darker side of human nature better than anyone I've ever known. She knew that if she gave your father power, he would eventually use it to harm you." The lawyer cleared his throat, the sound of shifting papers audible over the line. "Cassidy, listen to me carefully. Page 4 of the will contains a self-executing forfeiture clause. It's a legal tripwire. Evelyn Miller specifically designated you as a resident beneficiary, with an irrevocable right to occupy the main house and access the vineyard archives. The moment Franklin used his authority to revoke your access and physically expel you from the property, he committed a material breach of the trust's ethical covenants. In the eyes of the law, he didn't just kick you out, he triggered his own immediate removal." I sat up straighter, the coldness in my bones starting to be replaced by a surging heat. "You mean, he pressed the button himself?" "Exactly," Baxter confirmed. "By officially revoking your residency and attempting to liquidate the aging stock to pay for Keaton's private debts, he proved his unfitness to serve. The law in this jurisdiction is very clear on constructive eviction when it involves a protected beneficiary. He thinks he's signing the vineyard away to developers tomorrow morning, but he doesn't realize he lost the right to sign so much as a grocery receipt the second he slammed that door on you. I've already drafted the emergency injunction for the Napa County Superior Court. We meet at the courthouse at 8 a.m. Sleep if you can, Cassidy. Tomorrow we don't just ask for your home back, we take the empire." I hung up the phone and looked down at the journal. The ink had blurred in places from the wine, but the knowledge within it was still intact. Grandma hadn't just left me a vineyard. She had left me a fortress, and my father had just handed me the keys by trying to throw me away. For the first time in days, the scent of the rain outside didn't feel like a funeral. It felt like a cleansing. The morning of the 4th day arrived with a crisp, indifferent clarity that seemed to mock the chaos of the previous 72 hours. By 9 a.m., the opulent conference room of the downtown notary office was filled with the heavy scent of expensive cologne and the predatory energy of a closed-door deal. Franklin sat at the head of the polished oak table, flanked by Keaton, who looked remarkably rejuvenated now that he believed his gambling debts were minutes away from being erased. They were surrounded by the developers from the golf resort group, a circle of men in tailored suits, ready to sign away a century of Miller history for a few signatures and a wire transfer. Franklin picked up the gold-plated fountain pen, a smug, practiced smile playing on his lips as he glanced at the contract. He was a man who believed he had successfully pruned the only branch of his family tree that dared to resist him. "This is for the best, Franklin," Rosemary murmured from the side, her voice smooth and devoid of any lingering regret. "We're finally shedding the dead weight." Just as the pen nib touched the signature line, the heavy glass doors of the office swung open with a deliberate, echoing force. I walked in first, no longer the drenched, broken woman they had shoved into the mud. I wore a sharp charcoal suit, the kind that commanded respect in a boardroom, and my eyes were fixed directly on my father. Behind me followed Mr. Baxter, his leather briefcase held like a weapon. The atmosphere in the room shifted instantly. The developers looked up in confusion, while Keaton's face drained of color, his smirk vanishing like mist in the sun. "What is the meaning of this intrusion?" Franklin barked, slamming his hand on the table. "Cassidy, I told you that you are no longer welcome in our business. Security, remove her." Mr. Baxter stepped forward before the secretary could even reach for the phone. With a chillingly calm demeanor, he reached into his briefcase and produced a thick stack of documents stamped with the official seal of the Napa County Superior Court. "I wouldn't do that if I were you, Franklin," the lawyer said, his voice cutting through the tension like a blade. "I am here to serve you with an emergency injunction issued by Judge Miller, no relation, though I'm sure she found your conduct just as distasteful as I did. This order immediately halts any and all transactions involving the Miller estate." Franklin let out a harsh, disbelieving laugh. "On what grounds I am the trustee, I have the legal authority to manage this property." "You were the trustee, Mr. Baxter corrected, leaning over the table to place a copy of page 4 directly over the sale contract. "The court has found probable cause that you committed a profound breach of fiduciary duty. Your grandmother's will contained an automatic succession clause, Franklin. The moment you committed a constructive eviction against a protected beneficiary, which was captured quite clearly on your own driveway security cameras, I might add, you triggered your immediate disqualification. Furthermore, your attempt to use estate equity to settle Keaton's private margin calls constitutes a criminal misuse of trust funds." The room went deathly silent. The lead developer slowly pulled the contract toward himself, his interest in the deal evaporating as he realized he was standing on a legal landmine. Keaton began to stammer, his eyes darting toward the exit, while Rosemary looked as though she had been struck. "Under the anti-betrayal provisions drafted by Evelyn Miller, Mr. Baxter continued, his voice rising with authority, your rights as manager are revoked in favor of the designated successor who has proven her commitment to the land. As of 8:45 a.m. this morning, Cassidy Miller has been sworn in as the sole legal owner and administrator of the Miller estate. You are no longer signing for this vineyard, Franklin. You are merely a guest who has stayed far too long." I walked to the head of the table and picked up the gold pen my father had dropped. I didn't look at the developers. I looked at the man who had tried to erase me. "The deep roots found the water, Franklin," I said, my voice steady and cold. "And now the drought is yours." I turned to the notary, my hand firm as I signed the document that solidified my control. The king and his prince had been checkmated by the very moves they thought would win them the game. In the weeks that followed my legal reinstatement, the air at the Miller estate began to shift, losing its toxic edge of desperation and replacing it with the rhythmic, grounded hum of a real harvest. The grand manor house, once a theater for Franklin's vanity, stood quiet under the golden California sun. I didn't cast my family out onto the streets. Grandma Evelyn Miller's spirit was one of justice, not mindless cruelty. Instead, I exercised my new authority to move Franklin and Rosemary into the modest cottages previously reserved for the seasonal vineyard managers. They remained on the land they once tried to sell, but now they lived under my direct supervision, stripped of their titles and their access to the family accounts. Keaton, however, faced a much harsher reality. Without the estate's equity to shield him, he was left to face a barrage of financial fraud lawsuits alone, his hollow empire of digital smoke and mirrors finally collapsing under the weight of his own deceit. Watching my parents walk across the gravel paths they once viewed as their private kingdom, now merely residents of the staff quarters, was a somber reminder of how quickly the tide can turn. They were forced to witness the very things they had mocked: the sweat, the dirt, and the slow, agonizing patience required to produce a single bottle of world-class wine. I spent my days in the cellars working alongside the staff to recover the barrels they had tried to liquidate. We spent hours testing the pH levels, checking the oak integration, and ensuring that the legacy Ba had started would not be tarnished by their brief moment of greed. The soil, which had been neglected in their rush to sell, began to breathe again under proper care, and the vines seemed to stand taller as if they too felt the change in leadership. As I stood overlooking the valley during the final sunset of the harvest, I realized that this journey had taught me more than any viticulture degree ever could. The first and perhaps most vital lesson was the power of silent preparation. Success is rarely a loud, flashing event. It is built in the shadows, rooted in a deep understanding of the rules and a refusal to take shortcuts. Like the ancient grapevines Grandma loved so much, my strength didn't come from the surface prestige my father valued. It came from the years I spent pushing my roots into the hard, unforgiving clay of hard work and legal literacy. While Franklin was busy performing the role of a tycoon, I was busy understanding the foundation of the trust. When the drought of betrayal arrived, I had a reservoir of knowledge they didn't even know existed. The second lesson was the undeniable weight of integrity. Integrity is a currency that never devalues even when the market crashes. Franklin and Keaton believed that greed was a superpower, a tool that would allow them to win at the starting line. And they did win for a moment. They had the house, the cars, and the social standing. But because their victory was built on the shifting sands of dishonesty, it couldn't survive a single legal challenge. Integrity isn't just about doing the right thing. It's about building a life that is structurally sound. My grandmother didn't choose me because I was the most aggressive. She chose me because she knew my word was as solid as the limestone beneath our feet. Finally, I learned the true meaning of autonomy. For years, I allowed their labels of family failure and field hand to echo in the back of my mind, letting their distorted perception of my value dictate my emotions. But the moment I stopped looking for their approval was the moment I became untouchable. You must never let the names others call you shake your belief in your own mission. If you know who you are, and you know the depth of your roots, no storm can uproot you. Today, the Miller estate is no longer just a trophy for the elite. It is a center for sustainable agriculture and a testament to the fact that truth eventually finds its way to the light. I am Cassidy Miller, and I am no longer just a daughter or a specialist. I am the steward of a legacy that honors the struggle as much as the wine. The deep roots have finally found the water, and the vineyard has never tasted sweeter.